Cherubs, portraits are an interesting genre of painting. I mean, I get it. In some ways, they're like not interesting at all. Like in some ways, they're the equivalent of a simple photograph of an old rich person, so who cares? But I don't know, there's some interesting stuff in there. Like by looking at a portrait, you can see how a particular time and place dealt with different systems of identity. Like how they use symbols of masculinity or femininity or wealth or humility or pride in one's city or one's family. There's something interesting to mine within that genre. Portraits are interesting artifacts that can give us a platform to discuss how shared cultural symbols point towards certain modes of identification. And then we can reflect on our own symbols that promote certain identifications or whatever. I guess I'm trying to say that if we can recognize the symbols and cultural markers of the past, then we might build the tools to identify them in our present as well. Anyway, that used to be the most interesting thought I had about portraits. Then I saw paintings by Lynette Yiadom-Boakye, and they revealed to me a much greater potential for the genre. So I'm going to need to work through some of these thoughts in this video essay. Stay with me. Before we dig into one of her paintings specifically, let's take a quick look at how portraits usually work. This is a portrait of Sir Francis Drake from 1591. We can understand a lot about how masculinity and power were illustrated in England in 1591 from this painting. Additionally, we can explore the way that the artist leveraged those associations, symbols, and identifiers in order to build an idealized image of the famous pirate turned admiral. First, Drake is clearly doing a power pose with his left hand on a sword, both of which we can assume with some level of certainty reference his physical strength and power. He also has his coat of arms painted in the corner, and he's wearing this little jewel near his navel. And both of these items reference his social and political status. That jewel features so prominently on his person because it was given to him by Queen Elizabeth after he organized the defeat of the Spanish Armada, an accomplishment of which he was clearly proud. And he also stands near a globe, which references his status as the second person to circumnavigate the Earth, another accomplishment of which he was clearly proud. So the portrait references a bunch of real physical qualities. We might call these elements of the painting representational, his appearance, posture, etc. We also have a bunch of culturally constructed elements in this portrait, his social position, masculinity, political success, and so on. On top of that, it also includes a few biographical details that he and the artist found important and notable. His trip around the world, for example. We might call these elements of the painting indexical and symbolic. They reference systems of meaning outside of the painting. From this painting, we can see how Sir Francis Drake wanted the world and history to see him. A strong man who traveled the world and served his nation and his queen. He's successfully used the symbols to establish himself as a man of nobility. Cool. And from this success, we, as viewers of this painting in the 21st century, can learn about how the 16th century communicated those things. We can answer questions like, how did Elizabethan England perform physical or political strength? How did they use symbols to communicate relationships or accomplishments? And learning about those things is interesting. It's fun. For a very specific definition of fun, but if you're still watching this video, I assume that you're part of the corner of the internet that is with me on this one. But there's more. I think one of the truly interesting parts of portraiture is, as the art historian Erwin Panofsky observed, a portrait aims by definition at two essentials. On the one hand, it seeks to bring out whatever it is in which the sitter differs from the rest of humanity and would even differ from himself were he portrayed at a different moment or in a different situation. And this is what distinguishes a portrait from an ideal figure or type. On the other hand, it seeks to bring out whatever the sitter has in common with the rest of humanity and what remains in him regardless of place and time. So Drake is an individual because of his position and his accomplishments, but also he's a human being proud of his accomplishments. We recognize that look of pride because we've seen it before, perhaps in ourselves. I mean, we all curate our image, right? In some ways, this portrait isn't any different than an Instagram profile, but in a single image. Today, he would have just taken a selfie at every line of longitude and a separate image of him bowing to the #queen after receiving his #knighthood. Portraits are engaging, at least in part, because they show us a specific individual within the specific symbolic language and cultural performance of their time and place. But at the same time, paradoxically, they also show us a shared human experience. This painting is both of its time and it's timeless, which finally brings us to the artwork of Lynette Yiadom-Boakye. If we tried to play these same games with this figure as we did with Drake, we'd have some more difficulty. There really isn't much of anything that gives away this character's time or place. There are many places in the world that this person could believably be sitting, and there are many time periods I could believe he exists within. Like, I could believe that this model sat for this portrait yesterday as easily as I'd believe that he sat for this portrait in 1950 or 1900. There's really nothing here that places it in a specific time the way that Drake's portrait does. It's void of context, blank background. Nothing about the clothing that gives it away. There's that pretty timeless white shirt. I also can't distinguish the social class of this sitter. There are no signifiers for that kind of information here. If I look for symbolic items similar to the way that I did in the Drake portrait, I'd find, I don't know, this rope belt. So, who is this? The artist seems to have removed all of the symbolic and indexical meaning. She's removed all of the typical stuff that would have helped me identify the individuality of this model. Well, except for the representational elements, his face, his smile. Those seem specific and unique to this specific individual. But beyond that, there just isn't much indexical or symbolic information that positions him as a unique individual. All we're left with is the ability to identify what the sitter of this portrait has in common with the rest of humanity. There's that smile. It's his individual smile, but I've seen that smile before, the same way that I've seen Drake's pride. This smile is mischievous, but in a playful way, funny or joyful, like he's the trickster archetype or something, I don't know. But I can see what he has in common with the rest of humanity. Now, I've been messing with you, but I can, in fact, answer the question, who is this? The answer is that this character only exists in paint. There is no human reference for this model. None of Yiadom-Boakye's portraits have a sitter. This character doesn't exist in a time or place because he doesn't exist at all outside of these paintings. It's not based on anyone. So this frames a bunch of really interesting questions for us. Like, Drake wanted to curate an image of himself and project that image into the world and into history books. And it was important for him to promote the qualities that he found inside himself as virtuous or significant or memorable or whatever. And in a way, that's also happening here, except it's not the individual, but art itself and portraiture itself. It is the imagination and process of art making itself that is being memorialized in paint and hung in galleries. The product of embodied imagination realized through paint is depicted here as virtuous or significant or memorable or whatever, which I love as an idea. To drive home this point, she also applies her paint really thin so little specks of canvas peek out, letting us know that the form of the painting is being memorialized alongside the shared humanity of this imaginary figure. The canvas shares the space. In fact, Andrea Schleicher quotes the artist as saying, "I was always more interested in the painting than I was in the people." But for now, let's return to the idea of finding a shared humanity in the absence of anything that identifies an individual, including a human referent in the actual physical world. All of her paintings take place in these timeless scenes, blank backgrounds or beaches or other settings that do not reference any specific time or place. But the individuality and personality of the characters is always present. The images are not cluttered with a flood of symbolic iconography, nor are the characters themselves distracted by any clutter. I like what Andrea Schleicher has written about these portraits. She writes that their gaze elicits empathy. Their very lassitude relays an urgent call. In a world dominated by an inflation of images, words, and noise, of continually expanding metropoles, ever greater pressures of work, and the increasing velocity of life, it becomes both psychologically and politically important to assert these spaces of stillness and repose, places in which people are doing nothing. These manufactured personalities are free from expectation and obligation. The painting asks us who we are without any of our curation, self-promotion, or external influence. These are humans unbound by time, place, or cultural expectation. But it's even more than that. Sir Francis Drake was bound up in all the systems of power and cultural expectation and performance of the 1590s. These were inescapable for him. He was a man and had to perform masculinity. He lived within a monarchy and had to perform loyalty and service and veneration to the crown. There were external systems of power and values and identity that influenced Drake and his self-perception. And we are all bound by similar expectations of our given time and place, given our assigned social class, or race, or nationality, or gender, or chosen profession, or whatever. All of those group identities come with certain expectations that we will sometimes meet and we will sometimes find value in, but sometimes find abrasive, limiting, or annoyingly coercive. Our time and place and circumstance will come with expectations, and no one will perfectly meet those expectations that come preloaded in the group identities that we are assigned, and that's frustrating. So what's cool about these portraits is that we find a common humanity in them without those symbols and group identifiers. We can still recognize ourselves in them. They help us imagine a world where group identities aren't restrictively applied to our individual human experience. So looking at these paintings, I see a way forward, or a way to deal with the disappointments or dissonance created by individual identity rubbing up against group identities and the associations and expectations that come with them. On this topic, the artist herself has said that these can be a meditation on what a history is and what a future could be, and the sense of endless possibility and impossibility of the idea of not being fixed and not being defined by anything outside, and the idea that as much as things change, they don't. These portraits are what humanity looks like without the external coercive forces of cultural expectation or the weight of history. They exist within themselves inside the form of a canvas, and maybe that's what this guy is smiling about. And that's a good conclusion, but let's do a case study because there is one element of these paintings that I've not discussed yet. Their titles. The artist refers to her titles as an extra brushstroke. They add meaning and give us something that does direct the way that we understand them in the absence of other, more traditional tropes of portraiture. This one, for example, which might be my favorite, is called No Need for Speech. Two figures stare at each other in a completely blank setting. The unornamented, dark clothing they wear hints at, perhaps, some sort of dance practice, but it's unclear. They are clearly communicating with each other, but they do not speak. The title gives us a place to start our meditation on the image. My impulse to assign group identities to them compels me to see a teacher and a student, but it could just as easily be an older brother and a younger brother. And the lesson that I see communicated in the image is, like their relationship, and as the title suggests, beyond words. The relationship between the two is human and universal, and I've seen it before, but the actual articulation of that relationship, or the lesson, if that intuition is valid, remains beyond words. It only exists in paint, and that's a good place to end this one. Thank you for watching, and I hope you consider subscribing.